This session, basically my session is on uveitis. As basically this is a clinical entity, and it's not so simple as it sounds and spells. Basically it's a form of eye inflammation which affects the middle layer of tissue in the eye wall. And uveitis warning signs are like it comes suddenly and gets worse very fast. They include redness of the eye, pain, blood vision. The condition can affect one or both eyes. Basically it affects the age group around 20 to 50, but no age group is free from this. Even they can affect the children. So we have a special kind of pediatric uveitis is again a special chapter on this. The possible causes of uveitis are infectious disease or injury or an autoimmune or inflammatory disease. Many times the cause can't be identified. Uveitis can be serious, leading to permanent vision loss. So early diagnosis and treatment are important to prevent the complication of uveitis. So this instruction course is basically aimed to make it this uveitis very simple, very lucid to the beginners, like in the term of how to approach and investigate a case of uveitis. Then we have a small talk, like just a brief overview of anterior uveitis, then pars planitis, posterior uveitis, and then the treatment in our armatorium, like immunosuppressive drugs, which are used in case of refractive diseases. So to start with, the first talk is mine itself, and my talk is in how to approach and investigate a case of uveitis. Can I share my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so to start, how to approach and investigate a case of uveitis. Now, whenever a patient of uveitis comes in your OPD, you have seen the patient, so many question runs in your mind. What you have to do, what detailed ocular examination you have to do, what all detailed history you have to take, then what all targeted physical examination you have to do. Then after this, the another problem is the battery of tests in your armatorium. And among all these tests, you have to choose so that you can advise those tests which will suit your requirement for the diagnosis purpose, and even it suits the patient pocket. It should not pinch the pocket of the patient, because they won't get those tests done. And again, neither you will be benefited nor the patient. So to start with, you have to classify the uveitis. Any uveitis, whatever, any uveitis you have to classify, and that too under 4 subheading. The first one is the uveitis, whether this is acute, chronic, or recurrent. And in all these uveitis, that 3 months is the crux. Any uveitis which lasts for less than 3 months, it is acute. Any uveitis which is persisting more than 3 months, that is chronic. And any uveitis which is disease free and without any medication for more than 3 months, and then it occurs, that is called recurrent. So this is the first subheading. Then is the laterality, whether this is unilateral or bilateral. Then the third criteria is whether it's granulomatous or non-granulomatous. Again, in granulomatous and non-granulomatous, there could be observer variation if they miss those granulomas and nodules. So here you can have that variation in the diagnosis, but this is the subheading which you have to classify all uveitis. And finally, the location of the uveitis, whether it is anteriorly located, affecting the iris and those structure, anterior uveal structure, or the intermediate uveitis, or posterior uveitis where the retina or choroid is affected, or pan uveitis where all these structures are affected. So any uveitis have to have these 4 subheadings. For example, suppose if a patient is having anterior uveitis, you have to classify acute or chronic, acute, anterior, unilateral, non-granulomatous, anterior uveitis. So this 4 subheading is important because it helps in the diagnosis, ease of diagnosis. Even if you diagnose a patient, if he goes somewhere, it's ease for the follow of the patient also. And for you can streamline your diagnosis and your DD, and then streamline accordingly, you can streamline your tests. So what are the common etiology? It is commonly autoimmune, infectious, masquerade syndrome, traumatic, or post-operative. But in 50% of cases, no cause is identified and it is presumed to be autoimmune. Now then you have the grading of cells and flare. Now before 2004, there was a lot of variation in the grading of cells and flare because everyone, all UVS specialists were following whatever was taught in the Almata Institute or by teachers. So in 2004, a workshop was organized in Paris and it was named the standardization of uveitis nomenclature, what is called the sun grading. And in this, all the UVR specialists, they decided to have a common grading of the cells, flare, and other clinical entity. So it will help them to have a common platform for the diagnosis and research purpose. So as per the sun grading, if the cells are less than 1, occasionally it is grade 0, grade 0.5, it is 1 to 5 cells, grade 1, it is 6 to 15 cells, grade 2, 16 to 25 cells, grade 3, 26 to 50 cells, and grade 4, more than 50 cells. So what is cells? Basically, cells are the inflammatory particles released as a result of uveitis. Then is the flare. So what is flare? Flare is basically the protein which is released from the inflamed vessels and gives a foggy appearance in the anterior chamber. So when nothing is grade 0, when you don't see any flare, grade 1, it is faint flare, grade 2 is moderate flare, where the iris and lens details are clear, but you can see the foggy things in the anterior chamber. Then grade 3 is the marked, where your iris and lens structures are hazy. And grade 4 is intense, where you can see the hypopene or the fibrinous exudate. This is the clinical picture. We have other talks, so I'll skip this. We are in first, you can see the cells, then second, you have KPs, then circumcorneal congestion and the hypopene. I'll skip this because we have other talks on this. Now coming to the investigation part. Now, this is very important because you have to streamline your test, because in spite of all the tests, we have to remember that 40% are still idiopathic. So if a patient is coming with a mild anti-uveitis first episode, you don't ask for anything. But if he has recurrence, then you ask for routine test. And for other patient where you have to go for some test, so you routinely first ask CBC, ESR, CRP, RA factor. Then blood glucose estimation is important because if you're planning to start oral steroid, you should have a baseline estimation. There's a chest X-ray, Montauk's test. Then in Bihar, I've seen many patients with recurrence, they have elevated homocysteine level. And if you give them vitamin B12 supplement, that recurrence decreases. So routinely here, I do homocysteine level estimation. Then if the patient can afford in recurrent cases, you can go for HLA B27 estimation. Then suppose with your clinical finding and your examination, you are suspecting sarcoidosis, then go for targeted angiotensin converting enzyme assessment. In case of vaginous and vasculitis, you can go for ANCA assessment. Then in case of SLE or juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, you can ask for antinuclear antibody assessment. In case of syphilis, you can go for VDRL assessment. Now to evaluate posterior segment, we can go for sonography, or in case of clear media, you can go for OCT, angiography, or ICG. Now, suppose if you have targeted means you have suspect a high degree of suspicion of some diagnosis, then you have targeted lab investigation for those disease. Like suppose if you are suspecting toxocarisis or toxoplasmosis, you have set of test, antibody test. Then if you are suspecting leptospirosis or fungal, you have set of serology test, you can advise them. In refractive cases, you can go for corneal biopsy, impression cytology, conjunctival biopsy, diagnostic vitrectomy, or choroidal biopsy. So to summarize, you have to take a detailed history, ocular and systemic examination, classify the uveitis, means do the detailed ocular and systemic examination, classify the uveitis. This is very important because it helps in your DD and even streamline, tailor making your investigation. Then you plan a tailored investigation and accordingly you start your treatment. Now, the last, I will just for the PGs, I would like to show a video showing this how to see this cell flare. Just reply. Basically, while you are seeing the cells and flare, you have to have the maximum magnification and slit beam in the size of 1:1.
In this video, I wanted to show what cell flare looks like under the microscope.
Am I audible? This video is audible.
With a lot of inflammation. And the best way to see cell
Yes,
flare
it's audible.
is being like this.
Audible?
Such that
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
the
Yes,
start
okay.
of your light
Okay.
beam is on the cornea to the left of the pupil. and one is on the right to the right of the pupil.
This
It's
part is
easier to
important.
see individual
How you have to
cells floating
focus the
here
beam.
with a black background in the pupil. If you make your beam a little bit wider, it's even easier to see these individual cells floating here.
Mm.
This is another eye with less inflammation. It's even more important. These individual cells.
What I was saying, when you're seeing this cells and flare, you have to have the maximum magnification and then decrease this beams split beam size. You place the beam on 45 degree, so at one of the illumination falls on the left side of the pupillary margin and on the anterior corneal surface, and other falls on the right hand side, and in between where you can see the beam, you can have those flare and cells which is easily visible.
Floating here. This is another eye with less inflammation. It's even more important to make our beam kind of short and a little bit wider. And you can see there's a lot of flare here. Looks like smoke. And you can see the individual cells floating as well. Here's another eye. Not quite as much flare.
Again, you have to decrease the
You can see these
magnification.
cells really pop out when you make your beam wide. And you can see that they're floating upwards in the back and they're floating downwards in the front. And that's because of convection currents, because it's warmer in the back of the eye.
Watch more eye videos at
So thank you.
Very nice presentation, Dr. Vishal.
And next I would like to invite Dr. Pooja ma'am for her talk on anterior uveitis, a brief overview. Dr. Pooja ma'am doesn't need any introduction. She is trained via fellow from Shankar Netralaya and the medical director of AVI Institute. She's a prolific VI surgeon and a wonderful woman. So on to Pooja ma'am.
Dr. Vishal. Thank you, AIOC and Dr. Vishal Kishore for giving me this opportunity on speaking about this very interesting topic. So I'll be speaking on anterior uveitis. So by definition, anterior uveitis is inflammation of the iris and the anterior part of the ciliary body, that is the pars placata, as a consequence of diverse stimuli. If we clinically classify this, it is acute uveitis, which is sudden and symptomatic in onset, it persists for 6 weeks or less. Recurrent, when there are repeated episodes,
J'ai frappé un bouton.
greater or less than equal to 3 months. Or chronic uveitis, where there's insidious onset and longer duration than 6 weeks. So going on to the pathological classification, it could be granulomatous or non-granulomatous. Always remember that granulomatous has an organismal invasion. It is insidious, it is chronic, and you have focal reaction in the and button fat keratic precipitase. As opposed to non-granulomatous, where there is antigen-antibody reaction, it is of acute onset, shorter duration of action, it is more severe, and you have diffuse iris reaction and very fine, plenty, and thin KPs. So going on to the etiological classification, there are different classifications that we have. The infectious variety, which could be bacterial, viral, fungal, parasitic, or others. It could be non-infectious, where there is a known systemic association or no known systemic association. It could be masquerade in the form of neoplastic or non-neoplastic lesions, or it could be traumatic. This is a very important slide where you have these clinical, specific clinical etiological types of non-suppurative uveitis. Uveitis associated with chronic systemic bacterial infections. It could be tubercular, syphilitic, or leprotic. When you have non-infectious systemic diseases, that is uveitis and sarcoidosis, Behçet's, then uveitis associated with arthritis, which could be ankylosing spondylitis, Rita's, Still's disease, parasitic uveitis, fungal, viral, lens-induced uveitis, traumatic uveitis, and uveitis associated with malignant intraocular tumors. Then you have idiopathic specific uveitic syndromes, the prominent ones I have mentioned over here. So the pathology of anterior uveitis is very interesting. Basically, there is inflammation of the iris and the ciliary body, dilatation of the blood vessels, and iris stromal edema. And what signs do we see? We see that the pattern, the color, and the thickness of the iris is altered. and there is accompanied circumciliary congestion. Now what happens? There is exudation of fibrin-rich fluid and inflammatory cells in the tissues. These exudates escape into the anterior chamber, and what result that we see is plasmoid aqueous or aqueous flare, like a beam of projector in a smoky theater. So, and very nicely, Dr. Vishal had enumerated about the different cells and flares and the different stages that we have. So now what happens is that the nutrition of the corneal endothelium is affected due to toxins. The corneal endothelium becomes sticky and edematous, and cells desquamate at places, and inflammatory cells stick to the endothelial layers as keratic precipitates. In severe cases, polymorphs pour out to sink to the bottom of the anterior chamber, and the resultant sign is a hypopyon. When the adhesions are localized and a mydriatic is instilled, it causes intervening portions of the circle of pupil to dilate, and what result that we see is a festooned pupil. Now, what happens is that because of these adhesions of the iris to the lens, the aqueous accumulates behind the iris, causing the iris to bulge forwards. An adhesion of the iris to the cornea at the periphery develops an important sign of peripheral anterior synechia, which causes obliteration of the filtration angle, resulting in a rise in intraocular pressure or secondary glaucoma. Now, when the exudate is more extensive, it fills the entire pupillary area, and the resultant sign that we see is occlusio pupillae or blocked pupil. And when these adhesions totally organize, the iris adheres and totally plasters to the lens capsule, resulting in a total posterior synechia. So coming on to the clinical features, the symptoms that the patient complains of is pain, diminution of vision, redness, lacrimation, photophobia, and halos. And the signs that we see are circumciliary and conjunctival congestion, keratic precipitates or KPs, and iris nodules, which could be copies or busakas. Then you see cells and flare in the anterior chamber, which is very important to visualize, and posterior synechia. So these are the signs of acute anterior uveitis. You see the hypopyon, you see the cells and flare in the anterior chamber, you see the iris totally plastered to the lens, causing posterior synechia, and you see keratic precipitates on the cornea and iris nodules on the iris. These are the copies and the Busakas nodules. The Busaka nodules are on the surface of the iris, whereas the copies nodules are at the pupillary margin. They're basically aggregates of epithelioid cells and mononuclear cells. So as Dr. Vishal very nicely mentioned, a first episode of anterior uveitis need not be investigated. It can be just be controlled with mydriatics and steroids and topical steroids. But what are the special indications where we need to investigate the patient is when we suspect granulomatous inflammation, a recurrent uveitis, bilateral disease, and a systemic manifestation without a systemic diagnosis. So locally, we measure the vision, refraction, IOP by applanation tonometer and slit lamp examination. And focally, we see ENT, dental, genitourinary examination for septic focus. So in uveitis, basically, you need to examine the patient as a whole and not just look at the eye. Skin test is useful, positive tubercular skin reaction in tubercular uveitis and a positive pathogy test in Behçet's. For associated systemic disorders, CBC, ESR, MAN2 and X-ray chest, or in tuberculosis, urine and blood examination diabetes, VDR and NCANS test in syphilis, a urethral smear in gonorrhea, in UTI you do urine culture, ASLO titer and C-reactive protein for rheumatic disorders, screening test for autoimmune disorders, and imaging you have FFA, ICGA, OCT, sacroiliac joint, X-ray, CT and MRI. So this is a very important slide where you have acute anterior uveitis and chronic anterior uveitis. Acute anterior uveitis, basically you can see in idiopathic conditions, trauma, all HLA-B27 uveitis are acute anterior uveitis, namely ankylosing spondylitis, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriatic arthritis and reters. Then you have Behçet's syndrome, the lens-associated anterior uveitis, which could be phacoanaphylactic or phacogenic, and the UGS syndrome. The chronic anterior uveitis, on the contrary, you will see in juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, in Fuchs heterochromic iridocyclitis, which is chronic, and anterior uveitis associated with primary posterior uveitis, that is in sarcoidosis, toxoplasmosis, syphilis, tuberculosis, herpes zoster, CMV, and AIDS. So this is just in brief, ankylosing spondylitis causes ossification of the ligaments. It is HLA-B27 positive. You have onset of acute anterior uveitis and pain and stiffness in the lower back and buttocks. And you can see the picture over here that I have enumerated. Ritus syndrome, where you have non-gonococcal urethritis, acute anterior uveitis. It is a seronegative polyarthritis. Conjunctivitis is common, and 85% are HLA-B27 positive. Psoriatic arthritis, where you have associated skin lesions and nail lesions, along with arthritis, and in the eye you see conjunctivitis, acute iritis, keratitis, and the secondary Sjogren's syndrome. Behçet's, you have recurrent episodes of orogental ulceration and recurrent gentle ulcers, ocular inflammation, skin lesions, and a positive pathology test. So you can see the pictures that I've taken from this textbook. These are the different things. And important thing is dermatographia that you see in these patients. This is posterior Behçet's, which will be covered in the subsequent talks. The glaucomatous cyclitic crisis or the Postner-Schlossman syndrome is basically just acute unilateral attacks of anterior uveitis along with an elevated intraocular pressure. And it is basically there's trabeculitis, there are fine KPs that you see in this and syndrome, and it is best tackled with steroid and mydriatics. Fuchs heterochromic iridocyclitis is basically chronic unilateral uveitis, a triad of heterochromia, cataract, glaucoma, and KPs, and etiology, there's no single etiology. So drugs that we use are mydriatics, steroids, calcineurin inhibitors, and antimetabolites, short-acting atropicamide, cyclopentodate, and phenylephrine, long-acting are homotropium and atropine. Mydriatics act in three ways. It's important to understand: by keeping the iris and ciliary body at rest, by diminishing hyperemia, and by preventing formation of posterior senecae and breaking down those that have already been formed. Corticosteroids are the mainstay of treatment, very useful in controlling the inflammation in the acute phase and also minimizing the damage of the antigen-antibody reaction. Where do we do systemic steroids in anterior uveitis? When there are severe acute anterior uveitis with a marked hypopyon, poor patient compliant with topical or systemic medication, and at the time of surgery in eyes with uveitis. Immunosuppressive agents have to be resorted when there are sight-threatening uveitis or a steroid-sparing therapy. And we use, these are the common drugs: methotrexate, cyclosporin, azathioprine, and cyclophosphamide. And this is the slide that you have to remember. So thank you so much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for covering such a vast talk in time. You can't cover the whole anterior uveitis in 10 to 11 minutes, but
that's true. Yes.
You covered almost touch all the things. Thank you, ma'am, for such a crispy presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Abhishek Kumar. He'll be talking on past clientist. He's Abhishek Kumar is a prolific VR surgeon trained at Arvind Eye Hospital and presently the director of Lakshmi Netralaya at ARA. So on to Abhishek.
Am I audible and are my slides visible?
Yeah,
Yes,
your
sir.
audible slides are visible.
Intermediate uveitis is one of the most underdiagnosed uveitic conditions. It can be either due to the
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Please switch the slide on slide mode.
Is it fine now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Intermediate uveitis is one of the most underdiagnosed uveitic conditions, either due to the inadequate knowledge of the examining ophthalmologist or due to the cumbersome technique which the ophthalmologist thinks about indirect ophthalmoscopy. So to diagnose these conditions, we need to indent with scleral depressure, and that's why probably the most underdiagnosed one. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Vishal and the AIS for giving me this platform. No financial disclosures and nil conflict of interest. So Pars plana is a flat extension extending from the posterior part of the ciliary process to the ora serrata, and it is a 3.5 millimeter to 4 millimeter in length. And intermediate uveitis, according to the definition, is inflammation in the anterior vitreous, pars plana, and the peripheral retina. And pars planitis is utilized for that subset of patients in which there is presence of snowbank or snowball and in absence of associated infection or systemic disease. So after going through all these nomenclature, finally we settled on the term intermediate uveitis proposed by this intermediate uveitis group. It is not very common condition, and it is usually seen in the young adults, and out of total uveitis cases, it accounts for around 8 to 22% cases, and mostly it's bilateral but may have an asymmetrical presentation. Although it's not hereditary, but may have HLA-DR15 association. And the etiopathosis is not exactly known. There is an unknown antigen which brings the pictures of vasculitis. Sometimes the antigen in the collagen in the vitreous may act as an autoantigen, and in multiple sclerosis and sarcoidosis, it's an autoimmune etiopathogenesis. As already said, it's underdiagnosed, and patients might not have any problem. It might be just an incidental finding when we are examining the retina, but some of the patients might present with floaters, mild blurring of vision, and photophobia. Pain and redness are usually uncommon. Conjunctiva might have mild congestion. Anterior chamber doesn't show much of a findings, but in cases of pediatric intermediate uveitis or associated with malignancy, they can have sometimes posterior synechia or scattered KPs in the inferior part. Vitritis is the diagnostic feature, and it typically ranges from trace to 4+. And as depicted in this chart, the vitritis is graded from 0 to 4+. On slit lamp biomicroscopy, we see the vitreous cells in the anterior vitreous phase, and there can be varying degree of vitreous according to the vitritis grade. And these snowballs are visible in the inferior retina, which are nothing but yellowish whitish opacities. They are not actually sitting on the retina, sitting away from it, and they look like an ant's egg. And on depressing pars plana, we can see these inflammatory exudates in the pars plana region, which are known as slow banks. And we can also see choroid retinal scarring at times. This is another picture showing the snowballs and the snow banking. And there may be presence of periphlebitis in the peripheral veins. The vitreous condensation sometimes causes degenerative changes, and there may be presence of posterior vitreous detachment and seething of peripheral veins, and the presence of neovascularization and like NVD or NVE, and traction can cause sometimes the retinal detachment. The most common cause of visual decrease in these patients is the cystoid macular edema. Nearly 70% of patients do not have any cause, and it's an idiopathic variety. The second most common is the pars planitis, and followed by multiple sarcoidosis and multiple sclerosis. The infectious causes like the universal diagnosis of tuberculosis or great mimicker syphilis, and other causes like toxoplasma and toxocariasis. In case of sarcoidosis, there may be perivasculitis, and if the patient is not responding to our treatment and patient is having recurrence, especially in old age group, then we should think about the intraocular malignancies like the lymphomas. And there may be presence of granuloma in case of toxocara. So diagnosis is basically on the clinical findings, and the tests which can be done like FFA, it is basically detect to see the presence of choroidal non-perfusion areas and the areas of perivasculitis and leakage, and also sometimes to detect cystoid macular edema. You can see the petaloid appearance here on the FFA and the cystoid spaces in the OCT. USG is done in cases of media opacities, and it helps us in recognizing the exudates over the pars plana, and UBM also helps us in recognizing the exudates and the cyclitic membranes as well. And USG can also help us in giving the grade of vitritis, whether it's severe or mild. The lab investigation needs to be tailored. So if the patient is not having much of a problem, we don't need to investigate. But if the patient is having visual decrease, then routine investigations like CBC, ESR, renal function test, and liver function test. And according to the diagnosis which we are thinking that patient might be having, it has to be tailored. Like sarcoidosis, we need ACE and CT scan lungs. And for syphilis and Katz's diseases, the various serological testing. Vitreous stab can be done, but it should be avoided because it might cause tractional retinal detachment. So it's better to go for vitreous biopsy. The various complications associated with it, most of the patients, as already said, have, lose vision because of the cystoid macular edema, and sometimes the chronic inflammation can lead to epiretinal membrane. The most common type of cataract is posterior subcapsular cataract, and it's basically due to the inflammation of the steroid being used for treatment. And also they get intractable glaucoma due to the inflammation. The patients might have optic disc edema due to the intraocular inflammation and may present with optic neuritis also at times, but it may or may not be associated with multiple sclerosis. And there can be presence of neovascularization at disc or elsewhere, and features of vasculitis signifying the presence of ischemia. And retinal detachment can also be there. The various varieties like exudative or the rhegmatogenous due to dialysis at the snowbank, and also the tractional due to the presence of traction and due to cyclitic membranes and other membranes. The treatment is followed a step-by-step treatment, which was proposed by Kaplan. So if the patient is having mild decrease in vision, we don't need to treat. And if the patient is having vision worse than 6/12, then the first step in treatment is periocular deposteroids like triamcinolone. 0.5 to 1 ml is given. It can be in the subsenon space, and it can be repeated 6 to 8 weeks. If it is not, the patient is not responding, we can add systemic steroids like omnacotil or the prednisolone at the dose of 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg body weight. And the newer tablets like methylprednisolone. Still, if the patient is not responding, we can go for immunosuppressive. There's a very good talk on immunosuppressive, so I'm not going to detail. Cryotherapy is usually not preferred these days because of the tractional retinal detachment. And if the patient is still not responding, we can go for vitrectomy to decrease the inflammatory mediators and to relieve of various other pathologies. This is a patient, nowadays we have started using intravitreal Ozurdex, and the patient is not responding, then we can go for clocelanol acetonide. I'll just take 1 minute. And this is a patient who responded beautifully to intravitreal Ozurdex. And in patients who are not responding to steroid, we may go for newer drugs like infliximab or adalimumab. And it is important to address the various complications like glaucoma, cataract, and anti-VEGF for neovascularization or PRP and supportive treatment. So the take-home message is careful clinical examination in case of vitritis with slit lamp biomicroscopy and mandatory indirect ophthalmoscopy is important to diagnose this condition, and early treatment is needed to prevent dreaded sequelae. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek, for a wonderful presentation. So our next talk is by Dr. Deepak Agarwal, sir. He'll be talking on posterior uveitis. Dr. Deepak Agarwal, sir, is a trained VR fellow from Arvind Eye Hospital, prolific VR surgeon, and a director of Harrier Eye Hospital. So on to Deepak, sir.
Good morning, everyone. At this outset, I would like to thank Dr. Vishal and AIOC for giving me this opportunity to be here. Posterior uveitis is basically inflammation of the choroid with inflammation of the adjacent structures such as the retina, the vitreous, the optic nerve head, and the retinal vessels. So already clinical approach has been discussed, but it is important to have a good medical history because that will give us an insight into the etiology of the disease. For example, if the patient is having fever, malaise, cough, expectoration, it may point on towards tuberculosis. Travel history, a person who is traveling too much, there may be a suspicion of systemic of syphilis also. So a proper history has to be elucidated. Next, it is important to know whether it is a posterior uveitis or is it a part of a pan-uveitis, because that will also help. Because pan-uveitis, again, one must think of a Behçet's disease, whether it is a choroiditis, retinitis, or retinochoroiditis. So if it is a choroiditis, then one must suspect sarcoidosis or tuberculosis. If it is just a retinitis, an ARN or a PORN, a retinochoroiditis, for that matter, toxoplasmosis. So how do we differentiate? It is important that if we think it is a retinochoroiditis, the lesion will be more superficial with involvement of the retinal blood vessels. So it can be classified into infective and non-infective. The most common infective etiology being toxoplasmosis, toxocariasis, tuberculosis, syphilis, viral, and HIV-related eye diseases. And in the non-infectious group, we have a spectrum of white dot syndrome. So investigations has already been dealt with. So I will not go into the detail, but I'll just go on to the most common infective posterior uveitis, which we see, and that is ocular toxoplasmosis. And it is usually unilateral, and in 72 to 80% of the cases, it can be congenital. As you can see here, there is a punched out central necrotic zone, and this particular disease, congenital toxoplasmosis, actually does not require any laboratory investigation, and it is more of a clinical diagnosis. There may be an active lesion adjacent to a old scar called as a satellite lesion. Acquired toxoplasmosis, as you can see here, has a typical headlight in front appearance, and it presents as a unilateral focal necrotizing retinochoroiditis. Vascular involvement may be there due to the antigen-antibody reaction, and this is called as styrylase arteriolitis. Management of toxoplasmosis basically involves use of drugs, which are usually which should destroy not only the cyst but trophozoite. But the problem is currently we have drugs which are targeted only to the trophozoite. So number of drugs have been implicated, like pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine. Other drugs used are clindamycin, pyramycin, and very commonly now we are using intravitreal clindamycin in a dose of 1 milligram in 0.1 ml. The next disorder is toxocariasis, and it is caused by an infection by accidental ingestion of larvae of the dog roundworm, Toxocara canis. And children who have pica and close contact with puppies are vulnerable. So it presents with peripheral or a posterior pole granuloma with traction retinal detachment, and it gives a picture of a chronic endophthalmitis. So these are the other presentations of toxocariasis. We can see whitish, grayish white granulomas. Confirmation of the diagnosis is by ELISA with the Toxocara excretory secretory antigen. Differential diagnosis in them one should suspect retinoblastoma, severe planitis, and juvenile idiopathic arthritis. In India, tuberculosis is endemic, and therefore one must suspect tuberculous posterior uveitis in cases of choroiditis. So tuberculous posterior uveitis can have a lot of presentations. The most common presentation being that of a disseminated choroiditis, where you see multiple small lesions of 0.5 to 3 millimeters within the deep choroid. So I'll just go onto the picture. So you can see here that this is a disseminated choroiditis, and there may be involvement of the adjacent retina leading to retinitis. There may be serous RD over here, lipid exudation also. There may be neuroretinitis along with a macular scar, along with disc edema. There may be, the next presentation is of a solitary tubercular granuloma. And you can see here a hypofluorescent lesion followed by late hyperfluorescence. It may also rarely present as a subretinal abscess, where the lesion presence results from progressive liquefied caseation due to rapid multiplication of the tubercular bacilli and tissue destruction. This may eventually break into the vitreous cavity or even may cause ocular perforation. This is mostly seen in the immunocompromised patients as in HIV, or if the patient has been started on oral steroids without an ATT therapy. So one must also suspect sarcoidosis, syphilitic gummas when there is a solitary choroidal granuloma also. Tuberculosis also may present rarely as an endophthalmitis due to the rapid progression of the organism. And this again occurs because of treatment of steroids without concomitant antitubercular drugs. It may also present as a serpiginous-like choroiditis, where there is a progressive multifocal choroiditis along the blood vessels, or it may present as a plaque-like elevated lesion near the macula. There may be extensive peripheral vasculitis. Important point here is that it causes obliterative vasculitis along with the periphlebitis being confluent, whereas in sarcoidosis, the periphlebitis will not be confluent, there will be skip lesions. And it causes a lot of neovascularization. Again, the OCT may show a contact sign. The RP and neurosensory retina may cause an adhesion between the RP and the inner retina. So the next is viral retinitis, and in this ARN, we get to see that the triad of vitritis, arthritis, and periphlebitis, along with confluent peripheral retinal necrosis. Although the posterior pole is not typically affected. However, in PORN, one can see that there is necrotizing retinitis along with retinal whitening with sparing of the blood vessels, giving a cracked mud appearance. CME retinitis, again, there'll be again a brush fire-like extension seen in HIV-related patients and a pizza pie appearance. Syphilis again is a big mimicker, and it can present as a chorioretinitis, neuroretinitis, saltpeter retinopathy, optic neuritis. Anterior segment finding basically shows presence of roseolo, and in the posterior segment, one can see there may be a presence of choroidal granuloma in the posterior pole. It may present as RP changes, a saltpeter-like appearance, and confirmatory diagnosis is by trichoderma pallidum heme agglutination test, and it should be treated with long-term penicillin. HIV-related lesions may include pneumocystis carinii, PORN, atypical toxoplasmosis, cryptococcosis, candidiasis, and large cell lymphoma. DUSN, again, entity caused by the worm, and it is usually unilateral. And a myriad of non-infective causes, that is multiple evanescent wide rod syndrome, APMPP, DUSN, Krill's disease, sarcoidosis. So basically, to conclude, I would like to say that It is essential to differentiate infective from non-infective etiologies. Infective posterior uveitis needs to be managed with specific anti-infective therapy and steroids. Empirical use of steroids should be avoided because this may lead to a devastation, as in case of tuberculosis and toxoplasmosis. Tailored investigation should be used to come to a conclusion. Intraocular fluid testing for PCR and antibodies in infective conditions is useful. It is essential to follow up all patients with posterior uveitis to look for complications such as CNVM, hemorrhages, or breaks. And if there is macular or optic disc involvement, it can cause irreversible visual impairment, and therefore treatment needs to be aggressive in the form of intravenous methylprednisolone. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak sir, for a wonderful presentation. Our next talk is Dr. Vijay Pratap Singh Tomar, but he can't present because of some unavoidable circumstances. So I'll be just presenting his talk on, he has just passed on his presentation. I'll just, because we'll definitely miss, I'll just present, but we can't have his presentation. Like his presentation are basically the USP of many ICs. And I would like to just, as a part of introduction of Vijay Pratap Singh Tomar, we know he is the professor at RIO Sitapur. But apart from this, I know, to my knowledge, we have 3 mirrors of JB sir. One is Vijay Pratap Tomar, one is Amitabh sir at SN, and one I think Dr. Partha Pratim. Now he has again shifted to SN Chennai. These 3 people are basically the mirror image of JB sir. So to start with the talk, is my slide visible?
Not now, sir.
Okay, I'll just. Am I been made? Achha, okay, share screen. Okay. So is it visible now?
Yes, it's visible.
So coming to the talk of immunosuppressive agents in uvea. So every uvea specialist or any treating doctor, they have a goal, like have a round pupil, quiet eye, though it's showing hyperpin, but the end aim or goal treatment is to have a quiet eye with a round pupil without any synechia. We have many drugs in our armamentarium like prednisolone, betamethasone, dexamethasone, oral steroid like omnacotil, defzadlacort, then IV like solumedrol. But all these corticosteroid, they have complication, long-term side effects, many adverse effects like psychiatric issue, then skin and soft tissue issue, then patient may have neurological issue or cardiovascular problem. Sometimes they can have endocrinal problem like shooting of blood sugar level. Then in eye, we have issue like cataract, narrow angle glaucoma. In if you give to pediatric age group, it can cause growth retardation. So you have to just weigh the cost and benefit of this drug. So because of these adverse effects came into the picture, this immunosuppressive agent. But we have 3 big questions: when to use this, what to use, and how to use. So when to use, whenever you have sight-threatening inflammation, which is unresponsive, which is not responding to appropriate steroid therapy, or patient experiencing steroid-induced side effects or high steroid dependence, then you can go for these immunosuppressive agents. Indications are like absolute indication like Behçet's disease, sympathetic ophthalmia, VKH, necrotizing sclerouveitis. Then relative indications are intermediate uveitis, retinal vasculitis, severe chronic iridocyclitis, sarcoid-induced uveitis. What are the prerequisites? Prerequisites are like you have a steroid-resistant or steroid dependence or steroid related side effect, you sub the patient to immunosuppressive. If the patient is having non-infectious etiology, you can prescribe them. If the patient doesn't have any systemic contraindication to immunosuppressive drug, and 2 most important, there should be availability and support of the internist if you're prescribing immunosuppressive agent, and you should take an informed consent explaining all these side effects of this drug and how all the pros and cons of these drugs. Then coming to the investigation, commonly investigation done as CBC, liver function test, renal function test, Montauk's test, chest X-ray, HRCT, urine analysis, blood sugar assessment, and BP estimation. So what all immunosuppressive you have in our armatorium? We can divide into 4 subheading. One is antimetabolite, then is alkylating agent, then is immunomodulators, then we have biologicals. In antimetabolites, we have azathioprine, methotrexate, then MMF, then alkylating agents, we have cyclophosphamide, chlorambucil. Immunomodulator, we have cyclosporin, tacrolimus, sirolimus. In biologic, we have daclizumab, infliximab, then we have etanercept, immunoglobulins. So coming to methotrexate, common indication of chronic iridocyclitis, panuveitis, sarcoid-associated uveitis. We have to wait for 3 to 4 weeks to see the effect of methotrexate. The commonly used dose is 0.15 to 0.5 milligram per kg per body weight per week. Maximum we can give 50 milligram either in a single or divided dose. Now, since the absorption irregularities is seen after 20 milligram per week dose, so in that case you can give subcutaneously. There has been this interaction noted with salicylate, sulfonamide, tetracycline, chloramphenicol. So you have to take the history of using these drugs because it increases unbound fraction of methotrexate. Then coming to azathioprine, available in the market as Imuran in the strength of 50 milligram. Common indications are Behçet's disease, multifocal choroiditis, serpiginous choroiditis, recalcitrant pars planitis, sympathetic ophthalmia, and VKH. Again, the onset takes 3 to 4 weeks. Dose is generally oral 2 to 3 milligram per kg body weight per day. In this, patients should undergo CBC at every 2-week interval and liver function test at monthly interval. And you should take precaution while using allopurinol. You reduce the dose because of the interaction. Then coming to MFF, that is mycophenolate. It is similar to azathioprine, but it has lesser side effects, well tolerated by children. Common side effects are diarrhea and weight loss, and dose is up to 3 grams. Then the drug available is cyclophosphamide. It is a drug of choice in vaginous granulomatosis and polyarthritis nodosa associated with scleritis or vasculitis. It is the only immunosuppressive that induces immune tolerance to a particular antigen. Common side effects are myelosuppression, gonadal dysfunction, sterile hemorrhagic cystitis, and secondary malignancy like carcinoma, bladder, or AML. The dose which is commonly used either 1 to 2 milligram per kg body weight per day or 1 gram per meter square body surface area. It has to give in 1 hour in 1 liter of normal saline. And before you start this, you have to give 1 hour infusion of normal saline with 1 gram of methylprednisolone and 1 milligram of ondansetron. And additionally, after you have infused this drug, you have to give 1 liter of additional infusion of normal saline. So IV infusion offers rapid induction, transient neutropenia, and avoid prolonged blood exposure to acrolein. Coming to the next drug, chlorambucil. It has ocular neurobehçet's prescribed in ocular neurobehçet's disease, intractable idiopathic uveitis. Long-term dose can be used. It is low dose of 2 milligram per day. In short term, like pulse therapy, you can give high dose 2 milligram per day with 2 milligram increment per week. Coming to cyclosporin, usually used in combination with low dose steroid. Initial dose is 5 milligram per kg weight per day. Maintenance dose is 2 milligram per kg body weight per day. Side effects are nephrotoxicity, hypertension, hepatotoxicity. So in cyclosporin, how you monitor? You have to give in 2 divided dose, add oral steroid 0.5 milligram per kg body weight to reduce toxicity, and you check BP on every visit and serum creatinine at 15 days interval. It is said to be, it is very useful in chronic posterior uveitis, low dose of cyclosporin A. Coming to next, immunosuppressive agents, that is tacrolimus and sirolimus. These are macrolide antibiotic derived from fungus. They decreases response of helper T cells to antigenic stimulus by inhibiting translocation of transcription factor. Side effects of tacrolimus are nephrotoxic, neurotoxic, hyperglycemia, while that of sirolimus, it is peripheral edema, deranged lipid profile, hypertension. Tacrolimus is given in a dose of 0.1 to 0.15 milligram per kg body weight per day orally, and sirolimus is given 6 milligram loading dose followed by 2 milligram per day orally. Now, after going through this, the next big question, which one to choose? This is the biggest crux. So again, here the decision lies totally with the treating physician, and it should be based on familiarity with the drug with which you are comfortable. You have used it, you have confidence, you know the therapeutic action thoroughly, and you know the adverse effect and how you have to tackle it. And apart from all these things, you should have a treating physician at your known treating physician where you can immediately refer the patient if you find or see any adverse effect. Then what you have to do in recalcitrant cases? Only answer, never give up. So future therapy in uveitis, basically it is the biologic which you use. These agents are made through biological technique rather than through chemistry and directed against one particular cytokinin cell types or cell surface receptor, like alpha inhibitors, tissue necrosis factor, interferons, immunoglobulins. Now, TNF, they cause an induction of pro-inflammatory cytokinins like interleukin 1 or interleukin 6. They cause the enhancement of leukocyte migration and activation of neutrophil and eosinophil functional activity. They cause the expression of additional molecule by endothelial cells and leukocytes. Common alpha TNF inhibitors are etanercept, infliximab, adalimumab. This etanercept got approval, FDA approval in 1999 for rheumatoid arthritis, polyarticular GI and ankylosing spondylitis and psoriatic arthritis. It binds to both soluble and cell membrane associated alpha tissue necrosis factor and inhibits their binding to cell surface. Available as white preservative-free powder in 25 milligram vial. And before injection, mix it with 1 milliliter of sterile water to form a clear colorless solution. Dose is 25 milligram twice weekly or 50 milligram once weekly subcutaneously. It is given in recalcitrant pediatric uveitis. There has been conflicting report, but you can prescribe it. Never use it as a first-line biological therapy. Then is the infliximab. It neutralizes tissue necrosis factor alpha activity, binds to soluble and membranous form of alpha tissue necrosis factor. It decreases C-reactive protein, then interleukin 1 and interleukin 6. Prolonged half-life up to 9.5 days. It is given IV infusion with a dose of 3 to 10 milligram per kg body weight. First day, you give dosing is first dose, then second dose, second week, then second dose, 6th week, and similarly third dose. Now, indication of infliximab is Behçet's disease, uveitis and scleritis secondary to GI, ankylosing spondylitis, Crohn's disease, and vaginous and sarcoidosis. Then you have adalimumab. It is the first fully human monoclonal antibody drug approved by FDA. Subcutaneous injection of 20 to 40 milligram either once weekly or once every week. Indication is GI associated uveitis, refractive uveitis due to VKH or scleritis due to rheumatoid arthritis. Side effects is non-melanoma skin cancer, reactivation of TB, fungal and opportunistic infection. Then you have interferon. This synthesized by a variety of cell types with immunomodulator, antiviral, and anti-proliferative properties. Side effects are flu-like syndrome, nausea, diarrhea. Then you have interferon indications are Behçet's disease, intermediate uveitis, sympathetic ophthalmia, and idiopathic posterior uveitis. Immunoglobulins, they are unique among immunomodulator agents, as only medication which treats autoimmune disease without suppressing immune system, indicated in autoimmune ocular inflammatory disease. Side effects are aseptic meningitis, thromboembolism, risk of transmission of blood-borne infection. Now, drug which acts against interleukin 1 is anakinra and atezolizumab. Then drug which acts as a CD24 receptor, they are daclizumab.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you, but we have limited time for each speaker.
Yeah, this is basically
wind it up.
Yeah, this is the last talk. After this, we don't have, then we'll have a discussion.
Okay, no problem. Then you can take your time.
Thank you. Drug against the CD receptor is daclizumab and rituximab. Daclizumab is basically humanized monoclonal antibody against CD25 molecule, and rituximab is basically human chimeric monoclonal IgG antibody against CD20 antigen on B lymphocyte surface. Doses of daclizumab is 1 milligram per kg IV every 2 weeks, while rituximab is 1000 milligram for 2 doses separated by 2 weeks. Now, drug against CD receptor, one more, this thing, abatacept. This is an infusion protein comprised of extracellular domain of CTL4 linked to modified region of hemoglobin G1 antibody. Indication is refractive GI and psoriatic arthritis. Side effects are headache, upper respiratory tract infection, nasopharyngitis, and nausea. So knowing is not enough. We must apply, and willing is not enough. We must do. Thank you. And we definitely miss Vijay Tomar for his presentation, but it was unavoidable, so we have to carry on. Thank you. So house is open for discussion. Now, since we have enough time, so among all these talk like posterior uveitis, we have just given 10 minutes. So Deepak sir, can you say some key features which we should think while treating posterior uveitis and which we should look when we are suspecting posterior uveitis for the DD and investigation
Yeah.
part? Keynote.
Like I had mentioned, most important thing which I think is first is to differentiate the lesion, whether it is a choroiditis or a retinochoroiditis. And if one has doubt, so one should go ahead with a fluorescein angiography, because the differentiating signs of a retinitis on fluorescein angiography, you will find that the blood vessel in surrounding the lesion or within the lesion will be stained. There will be staining on fluorescein angiography. Whereas if the blood vessel is not stained, that means it is not a retinitis. So first, it is very important to actually differentiate the lesion, because then the spectrum of disease which we are going to consider is going to narrow down. Secondly, it's to rule out infective etiologies, like I had mentioned, because it is going to be very detrimental if we are going to just empirically start the patient on oral steroids, especially if the patient is having toxoplasmosis or tuberculosis. We may end up in actually losing that eye very quickly. So two important things are there. Another point I would like to share is the investigations. Like, how do we go around in investigating these patients? Because most of the time, I believe that in posterior uveitis, it is our clinical acumen which counts a lot, because most of the times the laboratory diagnosis investigations may come out to be not very useful. For example, and I would like to have the opinion of others. Dr. Pooja is very senior. She can also give us her input, because we get to see a lot of patients where we have suspected tuberculosis, but the laboratory investigations all will come out to be negative. So how do you go about? Do you go about treating these patients with ATT in the first go, or do you wait? You put the patient on steroid and then you see that the lesion is worsening and then add on a ATT. So what is the consensus of the others? How do you go about your treatment?
Yes, Pooja ma'am, your opinion.
Yes, that's a very good point you have raised, Dr. Deepak. Treating uveitis is mostly based on a lot of observations that you make regarding the patient as a whole. So the systemic investigations are a part of the examination, but a lot of times the history taking gives you enough clues as to what is going on. Starting from the patient's history, the gait, how he walks into your clinic, what are the condition of the extremities, the hands and the legs, whether he had any history of tuberculosis in the beginning or not, and many times the clinical features in the fundus give you a good important sign as to what diagnosis it could be. So even if the Mantoux test comes negative, if you see a well circumscribed granuloma, and if you see that the HRCT has some lesions, I think we have to be very careful in starting very high bolus steroids in the beginning, because infective etiologies can suddenly bloom if we are not very careful. So especially in infective uveitis, we have to be very careful to rule out the infective agent first and then go full threshold with systemic steroids. That's what I feel.
Yes, ma'am. Correct. Abhishek,
Do you all do HRCT scan for all patients with choroidal granuloma?
no, it's basically
Okay.
For choroidal
Abhishek,
granuloma, yes, definitely. I think we should go
we
for
should do,
HRCT.
and that is the
But
treatment itself. We should do, but till now we are not doing because of the patient pocket. But ideally, it should be done.
in my practice, I think if I'm suspecting tuberculosis, I first of all do the primary investigations like Montux and all, and refer all my patients to the physician to rule out tuberculosis. So I start them on the topical drops, and then I ask them to get all the investigations done and get it documented with a physician whether he has tuberculosis, he or she has tuberculosis or not. And once I get the report, then only I start the systemic steroid. But then also sometimes, it is very easy to miss tuberculosis. So at times it has happened that I've started steroids and the lesions have started worsening, and then I had to revisit my diagnosis and start the anti-tubercular treatment along with the steroids.
Definitely, follow-up has to be very good in these patients, and we should actually follow up them closely. Because most of the time, I have seen that the physician will always, most of the time, 95% of the time, the patient will not be having any systemic evidence of tuberculosis.
That's very right.
Correct.
Yeah.
But fortunately, in my practice, there is a physician here at local place who is a TB specialist. So most of the times, my patients, even if they are not having any active pulmonary disease, he somehow recognizes it, and I'm lucky till date.
Similarly, at our place, yeah, carry on, Abhishek.
One of my patient had this serpiginous-like choroiditis, and I along with the physician missed this tuberculosis, and the worsening was so fast that it involved the other eye and the scarring. So from that day onwards, I have been very careful of trying not to miss this tuberculosis.
Yes, because ultimately, ocular tuberculosis, only a biopsy will give us a confirmed diagnosis.
That's
and most of the time, we have to treat based on our clinical acumen and give a therapeutic trial of ATT.
Yeah,
correct. What Deepak is saying, because what Abhishek you said, 95 or 95% times, since we also refer the patient for ruling out TB now to the physician at our hospital. Since we have in-house physician, we refer them to chest physician. But most of the times, they don't prescribe ATT. We have to force them, like we are suspecting.
Yes.
And if you don't have any like contraindication, can you go for it? So on our persuasion, they start ATT. What Deepak is telling is correct. Means 90 to 95% time, this ATT is ruled out by patient. They are not at all interested in prescribing ATT. So that is a problem.
I totally agree with you. I think we have Dr. Partha Pratim Datta. So maybe have his opinion regarding.
He is there. Okay, fine.
Maybe have his opinion regarding what should be done for tuberculosis.
Dr. Partha.
I can see him as a panelist in our.
Yeah, he is in the panelist.
I think a very high level of clinical suspicion has to be kept in mind, especially because many times tubercular uveitis is a very tricky thing to treat, in my experience. So many times, even if the tests are initially negative, eventually the diagnosis points to tubercular uveitis. So a physician's role is also very critical in these cases.
Yeah, it has become like diagnosis of exclusion, where when you have excluded all the thing and you don't find anything, stamp it as a tuberculosis and start your treatment accordingly. Ma'am, any means keynote for this uveitis, how you should proceed? Like, since we have enough time and our talk was only limited for 10 minutes, so we can't cover any talk like anti-uveitis, intermediate or posterior in 10 minutes. So anything which we should look when a patient of uveitis walks into your OPD, like in case of anti-uveitis, if you have.
Yes. As you so nicely mentioned, Dr. Vishal, we have to be very clear in understanding what investigations we need to write in the prescription, because there are a whole battery of investigations, and it's a big burden on the patient's pocket. So with our clinical acumen, we have to keep ruling out, okay, so this is infective, this is non-infective, this could be HLA related, depending on this clinical signs. Okay, so the joints look like this, whether they are history of any orogenital ulceration, there's any history of tuberculosis. So a lot of times by a detailed clinical history and physical examination is what I want to emphasize in this instruction course. A lot of things are settled, and a diagnosis, a tentative diagnosis is made. At least we can make 2-3 differential diagnoses, and then we can proceed accordingly. Especially this is true in anterior uveitis.
True. Correct, ma'am. Abhishek,
Yes,
hello.
Dr. Yes.
Any this thing for intermediate uveitis? Anything which you want to tell?
No, I think it is very important to do indirect ophthalmoscopy and depress the sclera and look for the snow banking. Snowballs probably you can see without the indentation, but
Yeah.
for seeing snow banking, it is very important to do indentation. And most of the times it is underdiagnosed because we are busy in our OPDs and we just want to see the patient on slit lamp biomicroscopy and skip that step, thinking that no, we might just go away and the patient will get treated. But it is very important to do indirect ophthalmoscopy in these patients. And many a times you will see the presence of these snow banks at the pars plana region.
But one thing I would like to ask and share is that pars planitis, intermediate uveitis is sometimes recurrent. Most of the times we find it is recurrent. Patients will be very, even if we tend to miss, the patient's symptom will always be there. They'll always keep complaining of floaters. You
Yes.
understand? And I think we have to be very careful in listening to them, because their symptoms definitely will help us. Because even if the pars planitis is inactive and we look into the fundus, there will be some debris in the vitreous, old debris, and it may be sometimes very difficult to judge whether it is still active or is it inactive. And do you think the patient's symptoms will help us in some way in guiding our treatment also?
Yes.
Because
If a patient
because-
is symptomatic, it helps definitely. I think it will help, because if the
Yes.
patient is symptomatic, we have to treat. And what you said, sir, is very true. Like, we have to listen to the symptom of the patient. That is very important, because I remember one thing. It's not related to uveitis. The patient
Your
came to my
voice is
OPD.
not coming, Dr. Vishal.
Is it audible now?
Yeah, it is.
Audible, ma'am?
For
Pooja,
me,
ma'am?
it's audible.
Yes. Now you're audible.
No, the symptom what Deepak said is very important. Though it's not related to uveitis, but the patient, you should listen to what the patient is telling. And in this pandemic, we have become little careless. It's my personal opinion, because I think I remember one case, patient came with floaters. Simply he was complaining of floaters, post-operative complaining of floaters. And in this thing, pandemic, we just, okay, slit line biomicroscopy, nothing is seen. Central fundus clear. Okay, we'll again review after 1 or 2 months. Explain about flashes, everything, and just do the batting. But patient was having problem. Patient again came back to me after 1 week, but still that time, because of the pandemic, we were afraid of not doing IO and giving much time to patient. Later, the patient, I think patient was treated at ABI Institute by Pooja ma'am, and patient had break. Post-operative, he had break. He was to be, so we should not miss, though it's a pandemic and those things. But what Deepak sir said is very important. You should listen to the patient complaint. If the patient is very particular about some complaint, that means it is of recent onset and it's disturbing. So we should look into it. That is what book says, and that is what all practical, this clinical practice says. If any new symptoms occurs, patient is like always pursuing, like he is again coming to OPD with the same complaint, then you should pay attention to him.
So basically in intermediate uveitis, when would you actually take up the patient for vitrectomy? Do you think what is the indication for vitrectomy in the particular patient? Is
I
it like,
think
yeah,
yeah, Abhishek.
Yes, Dr. Vishal. Yes, Dr.
No, you continue.
you can,
Okay, I think it's if the patient is having recurrence multiple times and there are associated complications like the dense vitritis and the epiretinal membrane, and to relieve the patient of the inflammatory mediators and relieve him of these complications.
But don't you think can we start the patient on immunosuppressives?
Yes, we can. When we have exhausted all the four approaches to treatment, then only the last approach should be the vitrectomy.
Okay.
Yes. Correct.
I remember a patient. I think as we were discussing before, he complained of floaters, and I, as Dr. Vishal said, I just it was not during pandemic time, so I examined everything. Everything was fine. But still, the patient was complaining of floaters. I made him understand all the symptoms of RD and all, and sent him away by just giving placebo treatment. But the patient was not satisfied, and he finally went to LV Prasad, and they prescribed him steroids, and finally the floaters settled down. So that time I thought that I don't know whether you people are doing or not, and it's a question to panelists as well. Should we, like in cases of if the patient is complaining of a lot of recent onset floaters, and you don't think it's associated with retinal detachment, do you prefer to start oral steroids? I'm
Yes,
not
so-
talking about the retinal detachment floaters.
Yeah, Dr. Abhishek, this is a very important point you've raised. And one important tip that I would like to give in my experiences, always look for innocuous vitreous cells, because this is what we always forget to do. We forget to make an oblique beam, and if you see vitreous cells, and the patient is just complaining of floaters, there's nothing in the posterior segment, there could be pars planitis.
Very true.
Yes. True.
So that is one important thing, because when the patient comes with anterior uveitis, there is circumciliary congestion, and there are some synechiae. So obviously cells and flare are not so difficult to miss. But vitreous cells is something which we must always keep in mind. And I agree that patients with RD can also have vitreous cells, but if there's nothing conspicuously seen in the posterior segment and patient is still saying that he has floaters, I think this is an important sign too.
Correct.
Yeah, and probably the cells in RD will be more pigmented. The
Yes.
Schaffer's sign probably,
That's true.
and that may be a differentiating.
Okay, I think we even our time is almost over. If we don't have any question or query, we can just finish off this IC. Okay.
Can we have a group photograph?
Yeah.
Can we have request everyone to please on their videos?
Okay. I'm just taking the screenshot. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Vishal.
Dr.
Thank
Vishal.
you all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.
I
opportunity.
would like to thank all of you for joining us here for this informative session. It was definitely an informative one, and we did wind up before time, in fact. So thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for joining us for today's session.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Vishek. Thank you, Deepak sir.
Thank you, Vishal.